After launching with their funky tagline of ready to play, iCaur is finally ready to show off their cars themselves. This is the iCaur 03 and we have a very brief opportunity to take a look at this car and take it out on a very short drive to figure out what it's all about. Now, the iCaur 03 will be available in Malaysia in two guises, a two-wheel drive and all-wheel drive model like the one that we have here. The all-wheel drive model will be referred to as the Intelligent All-Wheel Drive or IWD with dual motors. This car produces quite a lot of power and quite a bit of torque, but most importantly, it has a 0 to 100 acceleration time of just 6.5 seconds. Now, that is powered by an LFP battery measuring in at 69.8 kilowatt hours, which gives it an NEDC range of about 418 kilometers, which means that on the WLTP cycle, you're looking at probably about 375. Now, beyond that, the iCaur 03 is actually a really interesting vehicle because in terms of size, this car sits somewhere between the B and C segment. However, it does have an unusually long wheelbase, which should mean more space inside. Now, because the iCaur 03 is an all-electric vehicle, for now, at the front, as you can see, there are very few, if any, air openings whatsoever. You find the eye shape here for the daytime running lights, as well as an illuminated eye logo right here in the middle. Your headlight beams are actually in here. And of course, illumination in the front is fully LED. But I actually think that it's the side profile of the iCaur 03 that shows it off best because as you can see, this car is very, very boxy. In fact, at first glance, this car gives me the same vibes as a Land Rover Defender or a Jeep Wrangler for that matter. It's just much smaller. Now, this car rides on 19-inch alloy wheels wrapped in GT tires. Now, the tire specifications have not yet been finalized for this car. This is a pre-production model. However, the wheel designs have been finalized. I do think that even though these are aerodynamic wheels that are meant to reduce drag and so on, they still look quite interesting. Talking about drag reduction, that's why we also have these flush door handles which hide into the bodywork when the vehicle is locked. However, all of these things are kind of pointless when you have a front end that is that bluff and a back end that is that bluff. But more importantly, this car is meant to look like an urban adventure, and I do think that in terms of the overall design, this car does do that pretty well. And just like the front, the back end is just as blocky because as you can see, it just sort of cuts off there, which I think looks quite smart. And in order to emphasize that urban adventurer vibe, that's why this car has this sort of extra storage box, which you can open by pressing that button, which reveals a little bit of space here. This is I wouldn't put any weight on it, but you can put stuff in here through this little net, which I think is quite interesting. Closing that, you can see the rest of this rear half design, which I think looks quite good. Again, you have those eye signatures on either side, full LED headlights, your indicators live in here, and you also have this little pause up here as your third brake light. Now, opening this tailgate will reveal a pretty decent amount of space. Once again, the iCaur 03 is meant to sit sort of between the B and C segments, and so the tailgate space, or rather the cargo space back here, is also broadly similar to what you'll find sort of like in a B+ or C- kind of car. The boot floor is quite high because ultimately this is an all-wheel drive vehicle, and so there is quite a lot of space required underneath that floor in order to house not only the rear motor but also this car's multi-link rear suspension, which is designed or optimized rather for off-road use. However, underneath this floor, you will find a teeny little bit of space, big enough for, say, one set of charging cables, but you also find the subwoofer back here for this car's Infinity audio system. One thing about this car that I would like to point out, however, that there is no tonneau cover whatsoever. That said, there are a couple of hooks back here to hide some things. There's a cargo net here, and there's even more hooks back here and a 12-volt socket, which means that even though you can't hide your stuff, at least the space back here is decently practical. Now, the interior of the iCaur 03 does still have that sort of rugged, off-roadery, adventure-y vibes, but it's all done up in very nice materials. So for example, this is leather-wrapped with stitching. This is also leather-wrapped with stitching. The top of the dash is also surprisingly soft. The tops of the doors are also surprisingly soft. And even though you have these exposed rivets and stuff like that, they're on a panel which is soft. Interesting. So it does feel like the interior of this car is quite upmarket, and that also continues into the technology. So you have this 15.3-inch central screen which controls everything, including things like your window adjustments, your mirror adjustments, even your child lock and stuff like that, all of that is done through here, which is, I suppose, typical of newer cars. However, when you're driving, if I demonstrate this to you very quickly, the panel on this side serves to show your ADAS functionality. The reason why this is here is not very clear because I actually have an instrument cluster up here which also shows me broadly the same thing. Why that's done that way, I'm not sure. Now as we move further down, you see all of these shortcut buttons, some of which do things like the 360 cam, which is so far being displayed very nicely. As you can see, the graphics render very, very quickly indeed. And beyond that, you also have things like your HVAC controls down here, which show that not only does this car offer ventilated front seats, it also offers ventilated rear seats. You also have dual massaging front seats, which is nice to see, I suppose. And of course, you have dual zone climate control. Now, beyond that, there is also Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this will be available wirelessly because at the moment, it's only available via a wired connection. However, triggering this does show that this is pre-production hardware, and so I'm not going to give it too much grief for that just yet. However, I do appreciate the fact that it's very easy to dismiss the Android Auto because as you can see, if I wanted to control my air conditioning controls, for example, I can just swipe from the bottom, or if I want something else, I can just dismiss Android Auto altogether. That I like, that I hope stays. What I don't like, however, is the fact that this car seems to have no buttons at all. There are no buttons here, there are barely any buttons here. There are buttons to open the door, however, but anything else? No. You want volume control? That's in the screen. HVAC controls? That's in the screen. You want mode controls? That's also in the screen. This is gimmicky, but more importantly, I just find it a bit sort of nonsensical. I think a few buttons in here wouldn't have been so bad, such as a button to lock and unlock the doors. That is also in the screen. Now, in terms of button reduction, that also continues onto the steering wheel because you can see it's got a very X-Peng-like design where you just have a couple of buttons on either side which control a multitude of things. The one on the left actually controls your temperature, while left and right actually controls your fan speed, which I think is quite cool. The one on the right mostly controls your media functions, but aside from that, you've got nothing else. Your wiper controls, that's in the screen. This acts as your indicator stalk and whatever else. This is for your drive mode. Oh, for God's sake. This is to control your gears, so forward, reverse and whatever, and you pull it twice in order to activate this car's intelligent cruise control. Beyond that, you've got a couple of cup holders here. Again, the wireless charging pad, a nice big bin down here, USB-A, USB-C ports. You get a decently sized door bin here, big enough for a liter size bottle, and you also have a cooled glove box. Now, this is cooled by the air conditioning and it is decently deep, but what I appreciate in this is there's also like a little card holder on the inside of this door, which means that you have more options to hide more things. There is also a glove box, which requires you to go in the screen to open it. That is quite infuriating. However, at least you have a powered ottoman for the passenger seat, and again, you have that massage function, so I suppose life could be worse. Now, in the back of the iCaur 03, life is still pretty positive. With the front seats out in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, I have a pretty good amount of knee room, like more than that much, and a pretty decent amount of headroom despite the standard fit panoramic sunroof. Now, as you can most likely see, I don't actually have that much in terms of under-thigh support because the seat bench is relatively low set. However, because the floor is completely flat and the front seats are mounted quite high, I can actually stretch my feet out underneath the seats in front of me without too much issue at all. Now, this car is decently wide, which means that you could actually fit a central passenger or a third passenger in the center seat without too much issue. Now, in terms of rear half amenities, I've got pockets behind the rear seats. I've got a couple of crotch coolers, USB-A, USB-C port. The USB-C port here will charge up to 60 watts, which means that you could theoretically charge up a MacBook. You've got decently sized door bins here, big enough for a liter size bottle. I've still got the Infinity speakers all the way around, and overall interior material quality is just as positive in the back as it is in the front, barring this one panel here, which is slightly scratchy. Now, there are ISOFIX mounts here, which means that if you want to mount a rear-facing child seat or a bulky child seat, it shouldn't be too much of an issue, although the doors don't open as wide as I might necessarily like. However, for adult passengers, you have a couple more cup holders revealed from the center armrest, and overall, life is pretty good. I'd be quite comfortable to do several hundred kilometers in this at a single go. Now, one of the things I would like to point out about this car is actually in terms of practicality, because as I have only just discovered, you can actually fold up the rear seat base in order to reveal a long, thin storage area back here, which should be suitable for, I don't know, an emergency jack or some umbrellas, for example. Now, of course, that does require the seat to be empty in order to flip it up, but I do think that the fact that there is space there at all is an interesting use of packaging. Now, one thing about the iCaur 03 is that while this car might look something like a Suzuki Jimny, for example, because this car is all electric with the batteries mounted underneath the floor in a cell-to-body construction, this car should promise very different driving dynamics. Now, the model that we're driving today is the Intelligent All-Wheel Drive, or IWD they call it, which is essentially the dual motor version of the iCaur 03. Now, this is sort of the performance model, which means that this car is quite fast. But to iCaur, the other purpose of this is the fact that this car should be pretty capable off-road. However, today's evaluation or brief media preview is more of an on-road affair, and so we'll talk about what this car's dynamics are like on sealed surfaces. Now, from the get-go, this car does have quite a bit of poke to it. When you hit the throttle, there is a little bit of a delay in terms of that throttle response, but once the car starts to get going, it really does get going. And of course, because this car's power comes from a low-mounted battery pack, it does feel like there's very little in terms of body roll and body lean, because all of that center of gravity, of course, is mounted nice and low. Now, because the iCaur 03 is very boxy, it also means that when you're driving through particularly tight scenarios, like the one that I find myself in right now, it's actually quite easy to judge distance. Although I suspect that this car might be about to return with a scratch on it if I'm not careful. And we're lucky today. And of course, that does pay dividends when you're trying to drive about in town. I imagine that a car like this through tight city streets like Bukit Bintang or Chow Kit, for example, shouldn't be a challenge at all. Now, one of the things I would like to point out about this car is we've been driving this for about 45 minutes at this point, and the refinement in this car is quite impressive. For something that is quite small and promises to not be particularly expensive, I'm surprised at just how little road and wind noise is sort of getting into this cabin. And in fact, even at speeds of about 70-80 kilometers an hour on a road that I know is not all that great, it feels relatively comfortable, it feels quite stable and planted, and again, the refinement is very impressive. Now, beyond that, of course, you will be concerned about this car's active safety features, if it has any, and how good it is. But unfortunately, I don't think we have that much opportunity to evaluate that today. However, on paper at least, this car should offer full level 2 semi-autonomy, which means that you should have things like adaptive cruise control, AEB, with pedestrian and cyclist detection, rear cross traffic alert, you have blind spot monitoring, that 360 cam that I mentioned earlier. You should also have rear cross traffic alert, which is certainly very helpful in a car like this. And as we've seen before from Jaecoo, this car should also offer something called safe exit warning, where if you try to open the door when it senses a vehicle or some sort of obstacle coming past you, it should either warn you or potentially in this car stop the door from opening altogether, since it does have an electronic door lock. But overall, first impressions of this car are quite positive. Now, because this car is electric, naturally there is a relatively limited driving range. As I mentioned earlier, even with this near 70 kilowatt hour battery, the WLTP range of this car is a little bit under 400 kilometers on a single charge. Now, of course, that should improve if you're driving it about in town, but given that this car has a very bluff design, I cannot imagine that the touring range or the long distance range on this car should be that good. If you're stuck on the motorway, for example, the aerodynamics of this car might not do it any favors. However, if you are looking at an iCaur 03 as something to just pot about in town for something that is a little bit stylish, a little bit out there, a little bit different, then I do think that this car should at least be worth considering. Now, the iCaur 03 will be launched either in August or September later this year, and when it does, we'll also have finalized prices for the cars. However, this exterior accessory pack, consisting of a new front end, new grille, new over fenders, new body cladding, as well as the roof rack, the cargo box, as well as that expandable staircase over there, all of that will be available as an option, hopefully from point of launch, but iCaur are trying their best to try and get that in as soon as possible. That will be an additional cost, including this matte paint. Now that concludes our on-road media preview of the new iCaur 03. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so you're notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, and you can join our new WhatsApp channel via the link in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe and buy fun cars.